The most terrifying warnings are the ones you don't understand until it's too late. By then, all you can do is wonder who they were really for. The rain was coming down in blinding, diagonal sheets, turning the winding Oregon highway into a slick, black mirror. I'd been driving for 12 hours straight, fueled by gas station coffee and the stubborn refusal to admit defeat. But when my eyelids started to feel like they were lined with sandpaper, I knew I had to stop. The Pine Grove Motel appeared out of the deluge like a ghost ship, its neon sign sputtering, with half the letters dark. It was the only light I'd seen for an hour. The office smelled of wet wool and mildew. The clerk, a skeletal man who seemed to be held together by the thin fabric of his flannel shirt, barely looked up from his crossword puzzle. He pushed a key attached to a green, diamond-shaped plastic tag across the counter. Room 9. The room was a time capsule from the 1970s, with a brown scratchy bedspread and a lingering scent of stale cigarette smoke. The rain hammered against the large window, a relentless, drumming beat. It was almost comforting. I was so tired. The world outside didn't matter. I threw the deadbolt, wedged a flimsy chain into its slot, and collapsed onto the bed without even taking my shoes off. I fell asleep instantly, sinking into a deep, dreamless void. What woke me was a sound that sliced through the rhythm of the storm. Knock, knock, knock. It was soft, almost gentle, but firm enough that I knew I hadn't imagined it. I rolled over, my heart thick and heavy in my chest. The red numbers on the bedside clock glowed. 3:15 a.m. A chill that had nothing to do with the dampness of the room snaked its way up my spine. Who in God's name would be knocking at this hour? Knock, knock. The same rhythm. Patient, I sat up, my sleep-fogged brain struggling to catch up. Maybe it was the clerk. A problem with my car. I swung my legs off the bed, the cheap carpet cold beneath my feet. Who is it? I called out, my voice raspy with sleep. For a long moment, there was only the sound of the rain. I started to think I really had imagined it, that I was just jumpy from the long drive and the eerie motel. Then, a voice answered. It was so close to the door, so quiet, I almost didn't hear it. You have the wrong room. It was the voice of a child, a little girl, maybe 7 or 8 years old. The voice wasn't scared or frantic. It was flat calm and imbued with a strange, solemn urgency. It was a whisper that wasn't a whisper. It felt ancient, dry, like the rustling of dead leaves. What? I said, stepping closer to the door. What did you say? You have the wrong room, the voice repeated, a fraction louder this time. You need to hide. Ice water flooded my veins. Every nerve ending in my body screamed at me that this was wrong. A child, alone in a motel hallway at 3:15 in the morning, whispering a warning. I lunged for the peephole, my hand trembling. I pressed my eye to the cold brass-rimmed glass and looked out into the hallway. It was empty. The long, ugly corridor was lit by a single, buzzing, fluorescent light. There was no one there. No child, no adult, nothing. Just the faded, patterned wallpaper and the closed door of the room opposite mine. I stumbled back from the door, my mind reeling. A prank, a dream, but the fear was real. It was a cold, solid thing in the pit of my stomach. You need to hide. The words echoed in the silent room. Hide from what? Then I heard it. A noise from the adjoining room, room 8. It was a faint, scraping sound. The sound of something heavy being dragged slowly across a wooden floor. I froze, my ears straining. It was a sound that didn't belong. The floors were carpeted. The scraping was followed by a soft, wet thud. And then, silence. A deeper silence than before. My heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I could feel it in my throat. I didn't dare breathe. The child's warning wasn't for a threat in the hallway, it was for a threat that was already here. What was happening in room 8? I stayed like that for what felt like hours, crouched in the dark, listening. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind sent a fresh wave of terror through me. I didn't move until the first watery gray light of dawn began to filter through the edges of the curtains. The rain had finally stopped. I had to get out. I didn't pack. I just grabbed my keys and my wallet, my eyes fixed on the connecting door as if a monster were about to burst through it. My hand was on the deadbolt when I looked down at the key in my other hand, at the green, diamond-shaped tag. My blood ran cold. The number scrawled on the tag in faded black marker wasn't a 9, it was a 7. The clerk must have gotten the key off the wrong hook. He'd given me the key for room 7, but I was so tired I must have misread it in the dim light and gone into room 9 by mistake. Finding it unlocked, I was in the wrong room. A wave of nausea and vertigo washed over me. The scraping, the child's voice. It wasn't a random warning to a stranger. It was meant for the person who was supposed to be in room 9. It was meant for me. I was supposed to be in that room. I fled. I didn't look back. I didn't stop at the front desk. I just ran to my car and drove, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. I don't know what happened in room 8 that night, and I don't want to. All I know is that the mistake of a tired, indifferent motel clock is the only reason I'm alive to tell this story. And I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, in that forgotten motel, a little girl's ghost is still knocking on doors, trying to warn the next person who gets the wrong key. It's funny how you can hold a photograph of a moment that hasn't happened yet. It is less funny when you realize you're re-standing in the exact spot where the subject of that photograph is about to die. The heat was relentless. It shimmered off the blacktop in waves, turning the long, straight stretch of New Mexico highway into a blurry mirage. My truck's air conditioning had given up the ghost about 100 miles back, and the lukewarm water in my bottle was doing nothing to quench the sandpaper feeling in my throat. When I saw the sign for the Sundowner Motel, with its promise of ice-cold AC, it felt like an answer to a prayer I was too dehydrated to speak. The place was a classic slice of Americana. If that slice had been left in the sun for 50 years, it was a single-story L-shaped building with faded coral pink doors. The office was empty, a small bell on the counter collecting dust. After a few dings, a woman who looked as tired as the peeling paint emerged from a back room, handed me a key to room 9, and warned me the ice machine was temperamental. The room's air conditioner, thankfully, worked. It shuddered to life with a deafening roar, spitting out cool, metallic-smelling air. I tossed my keys on the nightstand, the little plastic tag clattering against the cheap laminate. All I could think about was a drink, a real ice-cold drink. My lukewarm water bottle suddenly felt like an insult. Remembering the woman's warning, I grabbed the small, flimsy plastic ice bucket and headed back outside into the oppressive heat. The ice machine was at the corner of the building, tucked into an alcove next, a humming soda machine that looked even older. It was a hulking, yellowed behemoth, buzzing loudly and leaking a slow, steady stream of water onto the cracked concrete below. It looked like it had survived a war. I pressed the bucket against the lever, and the machine groaned in protest. A loud, violent, clunking and grinding noise erupted from its guts, as if it were chewing up rocks instead of freezing water. For a moment I thought it was going to explode. Then, with a final, shuddering clang, a few pathetically half-melted ice cubes tumbled into my bucket. It was better than nothing. I was about to turn away when another sound caught my attention, a distinct clink that was different from the hollow plastic sound of the ice. It was metallic. I peered into the bucket. Nestled amongst the sad-looking ice cubes was a small, silver object, tarnished and dark with age. I picked it out. It was a locket, heart-shaped and surprisingly heavy, with delicate floral patterns etched onto its surface. It was cold to the touch, colder than the ice itself. There was no chain. It must have been sitting inside the machine's mechanism for years, finally shaken loose by the violent convulsions I'd caused. Curiosity got the better of me. Back in the cool solitude of my room, I sat on the edge of the stiff bed and fiddled with the locket's clasp. It was rusted tight, but with a bit of pressure from my thumbnail, it popped open with a faint click. The inside was designed to hold 2 tiny photographs. The right side was empty, just a dark, felted space, but the left side held a picture, no bigger than my thumb, protected by a yellowed, cracked piece of plastic. It was a black and white photograph of a room. The angle was strange, taken from up high, as if the photographer was standing on a piece of furniture. It showed a bed with a rumpled comforter, a nightstand with a lamp, and a window with thin, drawn curtains. A chill that had nothing to do with the air conditioning crept down my spine. The lamp on the nightstand was identical to the one beside me. The pattern on the comforter, though faded in the old photo, was the same ugly geometric design as the one I was sitting on. The crack in the plaster that ran from the ceiling down the wall was there, a perfect, spidery match. It was a photograph of my room. Room 9. My heart began to beat a frantic, heavy rhythm against my ribs. My eyes darted around, comparing every detail in the tiny, yellowed image to the space around me. Everything matched perfectly. It was impossible, but it was true. My gaze snapped back to the locket, to the photograph, my mind racing. Who would take a picture of a motel room, and why would it end up in the ice machine? That's when I saw it. In the far corner of the room, near the door, half shrouded in the natural shadows of the old photograph, stood a figure who was tall and unnaturally thin, little more than a dark silhouette. There were no discernible features, just a vague, man-shaped patch of darkness that didn't belong. It had a strange stillness to it, a patient, predatory quality that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. Standing there, watching, my breath caught in my throat. I looked from the photograph to the corner of my actual room. It was empty, filled only with the shadows cast by the setting sun outside my window. But knowing it had been there, that something had stood in that exact spot, filled the room with a sudden, palpable sense of dread. I slammed the locket shut. My hands were shaking. The room no longer felt empty. It felt occupied. I felt watched. The stale, conditioned air suddenly felt heavy, charged. The mundane sounds of the motel, the buzzing of the AC, the distant hum of the highway faded away, replaced by the frantic pounding in my ears. I looked at the corner again. The shadows were deepening as the sun went down. Was it my imagination? Or was one of them darker than the others? Was it taller, taking on a familiar, slender shape? I didn't wait to find out. I snatched my keys from the nightstand, my other hand clutching the ice-cold locket in my pocket. I fled room 9, leaving my bag, the half-filled ice bucket, everything. I didn't look back at the coral pink door, but I could feel it a presence in the window, watching me go. That photograph wasn't a memento from the past. It was a warning, and I was just the latest person to find it, dropped from the guts of an old machine like a cold, hard piece of fate. There's a specific kind of cold that has nothing to do with the temperature of a room. It is the cold that seeps into your bones when you realize a door you know you locked is suddenly standing wide open. The drive had been a brutal 14-hour marathon through the monotonous heart of the country. Every town looked like the last carbon copy of faded storefronts and forgotten dreams. By the time I saw the flickering neon sign for the Starlight Motel, my eyes felt like they were full of sand, and my bones ached with a weariness that went deeper than just lack of sleep. It wasn't a choice. It was a necessity. The place was a classic, one-story relic. A horseshoe of faded yellow doors facing a cracked asphalt parking lot. The office smelled of stale coffee and pines. A stooped, elderly man who seemed as much a part of the building as the peeling paint simply grunted, took my cash, and slid a brass key attached to a large plastic fob across the counter. Room 12. The room itself was fine, clean enough. Anyway, the bedspread was a scratchy, floral monstrosity, and the air conditioner wheezed like an asthmatic old man. But all I cared about was the promise of sleep. I remember dragging my duffel bag inside, throwing the deadbolt, and wedging the chain into its slot. It was a habit born from years of solo travel, a small ritual that offered a sliver of security in unfamiliar places. I didn't even bother to change, just kicked off my shoes and collapsed onto the bed, letting the darkness swallow me whole. What woke me wasn't a sound, but the absence of one. The wheezing air conditioner had fallen silent. The silence that replaced it was heavy, absolute. My digital watch read 3:17 a.m., a sliver of unease, sharp and cold, cut through the fog of sleep. That's when I noticed it. A thin slice of light was bleeding in from under the door. A pale, sterile white that didn't belong to the motel's jaundiced exterior lamps. I sat up, my heart starting a low, anxious drumbeat against my ribs. Something was wrong. I distinctly remembered the darkness being total. My eyes were drawn to the door, and that's when the real fear began to coil in my stomach. Hanging from the exterior knob, visible only as a dark rectangle against the intrusive light, was a do not disturb sign. It wasn't my sign. I hadn't taken it from the back of the door, hadn't even thought about it. The deadbolt was still thrown, the chain still in place. Nobody could have gotten in. So who hung the sign? My breath hitched. Every instinct screamed at me to stay put, to pretend I was still asleep. But a morbid, irresistible curiosity pulled me from the bed. I moved silently, my bare feet cold against the thin, worn carpet. My hand trembled as I reached for the door, my fingers stopping just short of the peephole. The metal felt ice cold against my skin. Taking a deep, shuddering breath, I pressed my eye against the lens. The view was distorted, warped into a fisheye perspective, but the scene was illuminated with a stark, unnatural clarity. The parking lot was empty, bathed in that same sterile white light that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. Standing on the walkway, with his back partially to me, was a man. He wore the faded blue uniform of a maintenance worker or janitor, but he was rail-thin, gaunt, his limbs like sticks. He was moving with a slow, deliberate grace that was deeply unsettling. In his hand, he held a simple white cloth. He was polishing the doorknob of room 11. He didn't just wipe it. He polished it with a meticulous, almost reverent attention, his movements fluid and practiced. After a few moments, he stopped, admired his work with a slight tilt of his head, and then slid with that same eerie smoothness to room 10. Both rooms were dark. I knew they were empty. I'd seen only one other car in the lot when I arrived. He was polishing the doorknobs of empty rooms. A wave of nausea rode over me. This wasn't just strange. It felt ceremonial, wrong. I watched, frozen, as he finished with room 10 and glided towards room 9. Then he stopped. He didn't turn around, but his whole body went rigid, as if he'd heard a sound I couldn't perceive. Very, very slowly, his head began to turn. It wasn't a human motion. It was too smooth, like a camera panning on a tripod. His head swiveled until he was looking directly over his shoulder, his face now in profile. It was a skeletal face, with hollowed-out cheeks and eyes that were just dark, sunken pits. And then he turned his head a little more. I saw one of his dark eyes swivel in its socket, breaking from its forward gaze to look directly towards my door, towards the peephole. I ripped myself away, stumbling back, my hand flying to my mouth to stifle a scream. He knew I was watching. The do not disturb sign, it wasn't a request. It was a warning. It wasn't to keep others out. It was to mark my door. I stood there paralyzed in the center of the room, my heart hammering so hard I thought it would break through my chest. The silence from outside was absolute once more. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I didn't dare look again. I stayed like that, standing in the dark, until the first pale fingers of dawn finally broke the unnatural light outside. I didn't pack. I grabbed my keys, my wallet, and my phone, and I unbolted the door. The sign was gone. I didn't look left or right. I just ran to my car and tore out of that parking lot, leaving a cloud of dust in my wake. I never looked back. But sometimes, when I'm in a quiet room, I can still feel it, that cold, focused gaze, and I understand that some signs aren't meant to ensure you're left alone, but to let something else know exactly where you are.